Good morning, friends. And we are to be have an interesting hour with our friend Jenny Smith, who will be continuing with a interesting life. And I believe this is one about shelter, is it not, Jenny?
Yes. Well, shall I start? I covered the first part of shelter previously. By 1984, I was working for shelter for 3 days a week. My contract, which would be illegal today, stated that I had to work overtime if there was a need. So I was paid for 3 days a week, which left me time to care for my children and some of my political life, as I'd just become a county councillor in 1985. And I served for 9 years on Avon. I represented Henbury, first of all, which was really good.
Are you able to adjust your screen, Jenny? We can only see the top of your head. We can only see your mouth when you look up. If you can't change it, it's okay. That's better.
There you are. I do speak.
Well, that's better. Yeah.
Can you hear me speaking?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, right. Okay. So I served on other councillors on Avon, such as Michelle Woods and Grace Waddington, were wonderful in helping me become a new councillor. You don't realise how many hoops you have to go through, how many things you have to know, and how you have to keep your head down at times and don't take part in conversations, just disappear into the woodwork. But I started to find out things about the area surrounding the city, which I think have been useful even to this day. And in the last year that I was a county councillor, I had to hand over and I became a joint county councillor and a city councillor. So I was opening another Pandora's box. However, I was working for shelter. I constantly attended training in London, Birmingham or Bristol. Sometimes when cases came, as Winterbourne and Hastings Road had, into the office, then we had solicitors come down. They put a caravan up in the road and started picking up the houses there. That was the time when one of the solicitors got a spade and went and started digging up the side of the flats that are down there and found out that they had no foundations. They were built on sandbags. They were built before the Second World War. So they go back in time, those houses. They had a nickname, and we were always want to know how it came about. But we think it was because they were tied up with the old tannery that's still in Bedminster and still deals with leather. Our office initially covered Bristol, but slowly we started to receive cases from the whole of Avon County Council area, Wiltshire, Somerset and South Gloucester. Shelter did get round to opening another office in Gloucestershire. And Mike Freel, who worked in the office alongside me, actually went and opened that office, which was a bit of a relief to us women because we didn't really fit with him at all. He was the sort of person that wanted to take over the whole world, where we were trying to deal with the inertia that the world causes ordinary people. I used to have to teach other volunteers in the office. I took them out with me on my caseload so that they learnt. And the one thing that I've still got in the back of my car is a little leather case, which has screwdrivers. It has a damp meter. It has a measure, because I was looking for rooms. Lots of the buildings that were built the new build, after the Second World War, only had 8-foot wide rooms, and you could barely get a bed in there. And so I always measured rooms to see whether they were adequate if families had 2 or 3 children. Because sometimes the council just said, well, you've got 3 bedrooms, and actually they haven't got adequate room for them to actually swing a cat in, let alone have a child in. Over the years, was sent on courses to cover disrepair, damp, and condensation. We had a number of solicitors that were working alongside us, and I'll get to them in a minute. And what we tried to do was assure that tenants got security when they moved, because the old legislation was still around that meant that people could be evicted very, very quickly out of their accommodation if the landlord wanted it. So we worked with the local authority to encourage landlords to give secure tenancies. And sometimes the disrepair to the property was caused by structure not being built properly. And I'll come to that in a minute. I also took photos. I have a camera and I took photos of them. So when I wrote up a case and listed everything I'd found wrong with a property, I took photos of the disrepair, so that if they went to court, the tenant had the evidence there in front of the court as well. When environmental health came in, I often showed them the photos that I'd been taking. Under a Welsh case, it was difficult to argue condensation. Quick and Tafili, 1984, was a breach of repair covenant, and condensation in the house had not done any damage to the structure of the property, though it was destroying their clothing, causing mold on food. It was doing all sorts of things other than that, but that wasn't considered a legal thing that could be challenged. And I went into many homes where as soon as you opened the door, you could smell the damp in the properties. And it was absolutely terrible. And condensation was seen as normal. Hostels. I was looking for fitness for human habitation all the time, whether you and I would like to be in any of those houses. But at the same time, we had an awful lot of precast housing systems built all over the city. After the war, the government gave finance to Bristol to encourage builders to come in and build, because of the bombing, because of the deaths, and also because of the poverty that existed. And I have here a list of some of the different, I don't think people realize this city is absolutely full of pre-war properties. Everybody knows about prefabs. What you don't know is the ones by the side of the M32 as it came into the city were all made of asbestos. So that eventually they had to either take the asbestos out or pull them down. And that's why some of the prefabs went in the city. People liked being in a prefab, they loved them, but they could kill them and were damaging the health of people. Aries was another sort of house. And I don't know whether you've noticed that the houses that overlap like this, that were all over the city at the time, were the rain and the wind used to get under that lip. And I went to one in Devizes where their complaint was not only were they cold and they had damp in the house, but they were having the electric sockets blown out because the wind was getting under the lip and was blowing into the cavity walls. It was also causing some damp in the panelling inside. They're in Hengrove as well. Now, the government at the time, under Mrs. Thatcher, decided that something has got to be done about these poor people that have bought these houses that had all this damp and disrepair going on in them. So Mrs. Thatcher gave owner-occupiers only, not local authorities, the money for them to be able to do them up and envelope them. And so the ones in Hengrove that have got brick outside are the ones that are owner-occupied. I think it's unjust when things like that happen, really do. Yes, there's Cornish houses, and you recognise them. They've got concrete beams at the bottom, and then they have a lovely roof over the top that's tiled. And they turn up in Henbury and Hengrove, Knoll West, Hartcliffe. And I will tell you that many of them are flats. And if you want to go and live in one, for goodness sake, go and live in the top under the tiles, because it's warmer and free from damp, and not as the bottom is, just collecting all that. Concrete, when it's cold, causes damp air to turn back into water. You can see what was happening. I was learning about housing and learning to recognise them. I had a reputation in the end, and I was go along and say, that is a so-and-so. Oh, I also got the mickey taken out of me. They said every time I sat on a bus, I was inspecting all the roofs as I went by, noticing what was wrong with them and anything. You become addicted to that. So your job takes over sometimes in your life. Parkinson wall frames were an absolute trouble. And they were the ones that in Henleys, what was happening there was the Parkinson wall frame were actually on the walk. And they were moving, which is moving the plaster panels inside. And eventually they've pulled them all down, if you notice, and we have completely different structures there. They're getting dangerous. It was all done with absolutely good intent. There's another system called Unity, wool away. So if ever you have any younger members of the family buy and say, is it a system built in this city? And if so, which sort? To make absolutely sure you get it right. Bison wall frames had defects, which the government noticed in 1983. Easy Form was there. Avery, which were on Monks Park Road. And Asbestode, which really did have asbestos in them. And I sat in a house in Henbury when I became a councillor there and talked to a builder. And I said, well, one of the problems is if you start knocking plaster work, go bang, bang, bang on it, it shows it's hollow and it's coming away from its wall. And I said, that's because the old builders, to make it dry out quicker, used to urinate in it so that it dried quicker. And the builder said, oh my God, I did it myself when I was building houses. He admitted I was absolutely right. So some of the houses, if you're buying a house, bang the walls. When I came into this house, I went through it like a dose of sorts to make sure I knew, you know, and anything we found wrong in this house, we put right wherever we could. But then other people don't know until the problems arrive. Pests and bugs, all sorts of things happen with housing. And Dorman and Long were also around. And by the way, the steel company of Wales and who had done an awful lot of work during the war. And Dorman and Long, who were a major steel firm in the north of England, helped build some of the housing in Bristol. And they are in along the side, I'm trying to think of the name of the area. It's along the side of the, going up towards Avonmouth. And those houses moved. The metalwork didn't tie in properly, and they've had to completely structure the outside with bricks now to make sure that they're safe and good. As somebody said, don't ask Jenny to come and visit you. Jenny will tell you what's wrong with your house. But I think sometimes people needed to know. I learned about pests and bugs, and I know about mice. And I know that there are bugs that eat wool and clothing. And so I was really getting into housing and infecting structure. And when you had a shelter report on your house, we used to give it to the tenants. We used to give it to the landlords if they were the city council. But our difficulty was with the private sector when somebody has bought one of those houses, then sold it on to a second who turned into a private landlord. And then the landlord just didn't want to know, which was a shame. There were two houses behind the shopping centre, you know, the avenue that goes down there on the corner. They were 100% built of metal. And the condensation in them, because metal doesn't let you breathe, doesn't air the house, was so bad they pulled them both down after my inspections. And I didn't really want to destroy housing like that. So you can see I wasn't somebody most people really wanted to visit their house, because I would tell them whether their house was fit for human habitation, whether it was a precast system, and also to help them, I tied up also with some of the major solicitors in Bristol. As Kathy Niall will tell you, I knew her husband. He complained. He said, Jenny, you send me a homelessness case and I end up with a murder. There were allegations that the tenant had actually committed murder by throwing someone into the cut. So I soon learned that the underworld tied in very closely with housing. Well, it's about money, isn't it? It's about making money very quickly sometimes. Some of the solicitors I worked with, I was very friendly with Brian Cox. Sadly, he had a stroke the last time I heard about him. And he actually, for fun, decided to ask me out for a meal and took me in to have one with all the bailiffs of the city. He was pulling my leg. And I've mentioned Richard. Richard had come to Bristol, I know, I hope Kathy doesn't mind me saying this, to get away from landlords that were after him in London. And he walked straight into, it was almost as bad in Bristol, which was sad. And I hope it didn't ruin his peace and quiet as much as it could. I worked closely with Child Poverty Action Group. We sent cases not only to solicitors, but to such a wide range of other voluntary groups in the city. And so it was really good that I had in the past been among the voluntary groups and knew who was who and where I could get rid of situations and hand them on to the right people. I worked with Roy Douglas. I think he ended up as a lecturer at Bristol UE eventually. Ed Cape, Martin Keegan, Geoffrey Phillips, all the people that seem to have consciences in the city. And I tell you, they did. Sometimes they did something to help that they didn't get paid for. I shouldn't perhaps say that, but they did. And Peter Brown, Shirehampton area, we worked Avonmouth and some of the housing out there, some of which is system built and had to be refurbished by the council. I should think that the council thought I was a pain in their butt by the time we finished, because all this lovely housing that had been built with good intentions was being criticised, or we were pointing out the difficulties with it. Oh, and Wood Hodgkinson, Sue helped. I could go on forever. Oh, Derek McConnell, he was another one. I also met, during the course of that, Andrew Arden, which is a top barrister in London, took some of the cases, and David Watkinson, also a barrister. So we were working with some of the top brains in the country, and it changed me. I stopped being an ordinary Jenny Smith and I became a machine in some, and had to do all sorts of things and go into situations which sometimes were quite hairy. I remember in Weston-super-Mare, there was a landlord ordering me out of his property. You can't come in here to talk to my tenants. Well, actually, he was too late because the BBC film cameras had been in earlier, and they got moved out quite quickly after that. But he was threatening me. And I remember another one. That was also outside the bounds of Bristol. I won't tell you where, so that I don't divulge any private confidentiality. But he turned round to me and said, "This is my second marriage. I killed my former wife and her boyfriend and murdered them, and I'm just come out of prison." I thought, oh my goodness gracious me. Anyway, they were in Caravan. And so I had to work very, very hard to get them a secure tenancy with a roof permanently over their heads. It's strange how you don't forget these things, you know. Suddenly it comes back, I'm in a part of the city and I think, oh, I remember what was happening there. Where we are now, I'm losing myself. Oh, all this time, gypsies and travellers and homeless were walking in. And I am going to do a talk on that separately. But I did get very, very close to working with Anne Badgett of Save the Children Fund. So please listen to that, because I don't think people realise what happens with the absolute homeless. You see them on the streets. I saw them in the woods, and I saw them in appalling conditions. But that was another talk. I got very close to the squatting movement in Bristol and assisted them for many years. I do wonder whether Central had something to do with this, to get them a grant to help them with the bits of paperwork and the times that they had to spend money trying to actually sort out cases. And I know that I gave the squatting movement had a young girl who came from abroad, who was British, and she was giving birth to a baby. And she was in hospital having the baby, and she was going to come out, go back into a squat. And I managed to find a European Act of Parliament, and we were in Europe then, which protected her and let her stay with her child in the UK and have a city council property. So it was a matter of learning on the job, really. Each case made me go and do the homework for the next bit. I think it took it did eventually make me ill. I know that. it's just jobs like that. You can go on and on doing the right thing, the right time, in the right way, but you have feelings. And there were times when I was so angry about what was going on. Shall we go back to the structure of buildings? Valley roofs, pigeons go to die in valley roofs. I told my daughter not to buy a valley roof in Hawthorne Street in Knowle. She did. And guess what? Pigeons went and died in. They block them, and then all the water comes up under the tiles. And she had to have her ceilings done. And I remember one of the houses I first did when I first started in shelter was in that Totterdown area. And what was happening there was that had been very badly bombed, that area of the city. And the front bay window was trying to walk down the hill. And if you know what Totterdown's like, the hill's like this. And that was also when because I was inspecting the whole house, I went to the bedrooms, and that's where I saw that the blankets were so thin, you could see through them on the beds. And that's when I actually started getting other agencies in to make sure that they were getting proper bedding. And I kept saying to various other agencies, check the bedrooms. They put the nice bit where people see everything in the sitting room and maybe the kitchen. But if you go upstairs, that's where poverty really exists, because their pride won't let you see that. And they're entitled to their pride. Drains, I learned all the bylaws on drains, the Public Health Acts. And I got used to picking up drain covers and looking in and seeing why things were flooding and getting out of hand. And learned all about the Water Industry Acts. So you see, I was overloading my brain with all this information. Every time I got a case, I had to go and do research if I didn't know what it was all about. It became easier as time went on because I did know an awful lot. And it was learning by default, really, and mixing with some nice people. I think Hillary was wonderful to be working alongside. And you all know Hillary, but you don't know her by the name she had in those days. But she was stalwart beside me. I learned about the Clean Air Acts. And I suppose the Jenny Smith that had come out of the rural area that didn't know anything completely changed. Oh, I learned to do compulsory purchase orders and how to get either solicitors or to help environmental health do it, closing orders, eviction procedures. I learned about mobile home lawns because I was going in temporary housing of mobile homes, and enforcement notices. I learned how to look for asbestos. Matrimonial problems came in where people were tussling over who owned what and where. And as I said, I came across murderers. Also, when I was working for shelter, I went into Lay Hill Prison. Prisons seem to have existed an awful lot in my life. Not only did I do a placement in one, but I went into Lay Hill, and my job was to talk to lifers about what life was going to be like once they came out of prison, what benefits existed, where they should go to try to get a roof over their head, and how they should be helped by probation properly. So all that was on it. It wasn't just the ordinary city housing that I did. I did the Duke of Beaufort's Lodge House. That was quite interesting. Jill, who was a Quaker at Redland, she gave me a lift out there in her car because of the bad weather at the time. I had a Mr. Butte who'd worked housing in London. We put a call out on Radio Bristol to say that I was getting around on my motorbike, inspecting houses in really bad weather with ice and snow. And would anybody please be around to give me a lift? And we paid the petrol. And Mr. Butte came. He lived in Bedminster. He was a wonderful man. He'd been something to do with Air Force during the war, but he knew housing backwards. And he talked to me about goers and risers on stairs. If you have stairs where you can't put your foot down properly on it, that's dangerous. And people could have accidents. And anyway, I went to the Duke of Beaufort's lodge house, and it was like walking back into the 1920s and 30s. Stone sink, chipped, a draining board that was rotten, floorboards that were giving way. All the electric circuits had cloth round them, as they used to have pre-war. And I sort of went room from room, writing about this. The couple that were there, he'd actually been the Duke of Beaufort's chauffeur for many, many years until he retired. And he kept on about, well, he told me I wasn't to marry my wife, but I did. And I suddenly realized that the gentry decided who married who where. It was quite interesting. Anyway, we got to the top of the stairs and I'd seen the 2 bedrooms, and then I went to open the door and I'd opened it before he said, that's my daughter's bedroom. Turned out it was his daughter's bedroom that had died and had not been opened since the day she died. Sadly, I had to. It was a good job I'd done it before he'd actually said to me, don't go there. There was dry rot, wet rot, the floorboards were going. There was a bed in there with a teddy bear on. Oh, it broke my heart. But at the end of the day, I went to environmental health out in South Gloucester and asked them to go in and inspect it. And then I discovered that South Gloucester Environmental Health didn't want to do it. They didn't want to touch the Duke of Beaufort. And I thought, well, something's got to be done about this. So I wrote straight to him at the House of Lords, gave an inspection report on the property, asked him, as he had faithful tenants that have worked for him most of their lives, living in these conditions, to get the property done up. Oh, and all the Hoovers were fusing and all the rest of it. Probably get sued by the Duke of Beaufort if he finds out I'm telling you this now. But it was, I went outside and got into the car and told Jill what happened. And she said, this place feels like there's something wrong with it. She said, there's a feeling here like people aren't coming out. People aren't chatting on the street. People aren't actually doing what they would normally do. And I wondered whether it was just fear, sheer fear. So gypsies and travellers fitted into all this quite well. I learnt things about the city and the great and the good that I think are better buried. I hope it doesn't happen today. And as a person, I changed. I had really good people working alongside me in shelter. Hema, who was Hindu, came from Weston-super-Mare. She worked with us until her husband suddenly dropped dead. And we had a lot of volunteers come in, people that worked with us. My own daughter Penny actually worked in housing for a while as a volunteer in the shelter office when she hadn't got a job. And she ended up working back in housing for the city council. So at least what was going on was we were taking these volunteers and they were then applying for jobs throughout the city council. And I hope, and I think they did, take some of the principles of our office, not to run away from a bad situation, to get it sorted wherever you could. I think that's it. I probably could talk forever. And I do remember things. And when I was a parliamentary candidate, as I told you, I was in Bath, I went into buildings there and I thought this staircase is going to come away from the main wall. Lots of their big old properties go up and up and up with staircases that aren't quite joined to the walls properly. So don't take me into your houses because I'm watching all things like that. There you are. God bless you all.
That's good. Thank you, Jenny. I think I should get you coming round to my house because I think it needs somebody like yourself to have a look and frighten me to death even more than I am at present. I say my house, but I'm not the owner. So that's why I'm sounding so cheerful about it. Sorry, you take over, Ray. Sorry.
Anything you want to ask me?
Gosh.
I was quite happy for you to do your thing, Patsy, but I will take on. Yeah. When you look at the state of housing within Bristol today, do you have any views?
A lot of it's been addressed, but not all. Some of the cavity walls aren't as well done as they should have been. And we certainly need, I mean, David, I'm on your side about making the houses warm in this city. We did that with this house, the one we live in. I leant over backwards. I guess kept spending money. My poor husband was bullied. We're going to have this done. We're going to have that done. And I've noticed in this cold weather, although it's not bitter yet, the heating is holding in the house. And even if I turn it off, it holds in the house for a number of hours afterwards. So that's what we need, isn't it? People to live in decent accommodation so they're not getting all the illnesses they can get. It makes people ill. Also secure, so they don't think the landlord's going to come tomorrow and kick them straight on the street. I mean, there was a squatters case down in St. Berberg's. They'd actually squatted a property and all their belongings were just thrown out straight into the road when they were kicked out. And they had nowhere else to go. That shouldn't have happened. But then you have this thing about people have to have children before they really get priority or be very, very ill before they get priority. If you're going to have a stable life, you won't have children until you've got a nice roof secure over your head. So it's the chicken and the egg going through all the time. I know, I do wonder about, I came off, first of all, I was riding a bicycle to work in shelter, and then I rode a motorbike, and I kept getting punctures because I was carrying so much paperwork with me around the city. And I got a car, warm and secure. But I used to get so angry sometimes about the systems and what was happening to people. And I think that wearing over the years, if I ever think back about some of them, I get so angry. I went to Devizes. I did cases in Devizes. Oh, I forgot the Hungerford people. We went out to the railway in Hungerford, a disused railway, where benders and people homeless were living. And I tried to get them help wherever I could with the establishment in that part of Hampshire. Didn't seem to be getting anywhere, but Hilary took over. And Hilary was brilliant and helped them, got them food, got them warm clothes, got them all sorts of things to help. But they ended up in Bristol in the end because nobody out there was helping them other than the Bristol office. It shouldn't have happened. We need a service that is right across all the regions round about us to keep people in their communities where possible and to give them somewhere to live next to people that they've grown up with, not coming into a big city where they are not streetwise.
The survey, which was put out by, I think, Shelter and others, to say that the housing for people, the amount of housing for people has not been this bad since before you started in Shelter, you know, which I think is a disgrace. Because there is no good reason why people shouldn't be in housing today.
Yeah.
It can be built, but it's just not being built rather than cannot be built. I feel.
You reminded me, I wrote some reports. One was on the the Tory government made it illegal for people to actually live in, you know, caravans, benders and things. And that report that I wrote and we published was, you changed the law, now what about the people? That was its title. And I have got a copy around this house. But I did find when I was looking for this, which is, can you read it? A window on homelessness. And we did a homeless count. We came second highest to London in Bristol. And people said, well, what happened to Birmingham? I said they didn't have a team like we sent out. I sat down with the team and told them everywhere to look. They were living in the caves in Redcliffe. And I pointed out they were in people's garages. All the places. Our then main person, what's her name? Louise Casey, who has just done or going to do the report on football hooligans. She actually, when she left Shelter, changed the definitions of homelessness. And people living in a caravan, in a garage, in a hut, she did not consider was homeless. So you've actually got to be destitute on the streets before you get anything. I'm sorry, Louise, I disagree with you completely. Catch them before they get into absolutely on the streets. But this, yeah, it's the only copy I've got, which I'm thinking of giving it to the archivist. But I did wonder about getting it copied just so that I still had a copy, because it lists everywhere people are homeless. But it was a very, very successful, organised count, and it did find people all over this city that were homeless that really hadn't been registered. And the volunteers were wonderful. They went back and helped people when they found them to try to get a roof over their head. So it wasn't just about counting them. It was about being constructive afterwards. I actually, well, I told you, I got a director of housing who allegedly had a heart attack because of me. You obviously haven't heard that. But it's also, have I not told you that story? Oh,
I think
Well, right.
Continue.
Well, we were challenging and producing all this paperwork. So I went, we got somebody down from head office in London who was a solicitor. And he and I went to see the director of housing in Bristol City Council. And I sat there very quietly taking the notes, not saying a dicky bird. But he turned around and said, "A new young lady, those properties at 18 Sussex Place and 20 Sussex Place are not unfit for human habitation." Anyway, we get out on the street, and as soon as I got the guy down there, he said, "I'd already said, I've got some properties for you to see." And he said, "Where are you going?" And I said, 18 and 20 Sussex Place. And we went there, and I showed him through the properties. The poor woman was, the water was flooding as well. That hadn't been there when I'd seen it before. It was absolutely disgusting. And he stood out on the road and said, "Where's his nearest solicitor so we can do a writ of mandamus against these properties?" Mm-hmm. Anyway, when that went through, that's when the director of housing had a heart attack and left his job. But it also meant that somehow or other in the council, the hierarchy had obviously been looked at somehow or other, because a new environmental health officer came in, Rod Lambourne. And I recommend Rod Lambourne. He picked up the tab, but he did wonderful things. He sorted things out. He was honest. And it started to turn the whole system round again. So there were people in the council that absolutely loathed Jenny Smith and Hillary.
Other comments and questions, friends?
In an ideal world, what could we do to sort of sort it out once and for all? If money was no object, if the world was fair, what do you think Bristol could do to sort it?
I think we've got to help. Oh, by the way, this house that we live in, we bought under an optional mortgage, which the Labour government brought in the early 1970s. They don't exist anymore. And then the government changed mortgages, didn't they? And we got all sorts of different sorts of mortgages that didn't work and really ripped people off. So we were lucky. When the mortgages changed again and optional mortgages went, because I worked for shelter, I was saying to my husband, we're going to have an interest-only mortgage. We're not going to have one of these others that they've got. And we did. And so we now own this house. But lots of people fell into traps. I think the way people borrow money should be looked at in depth. And also to help people find the initial payments to put down on a, if you own a house of your own, you can take pride in it. You also seem to have security, which means that you don't lose your job because you've just been kicked out. And it gives people pride to own a little patch that they live on. So I think one of the things we've got to look at is the way people borrow money and how we borrow money, and to make sure that hasn't got, I mean, they're ripping people off at the moment. These people that are all suddenly gone out and bought new properties are now up to their eyes in debt. And I'd like to know how that debt's structured and whether we should change that in some way whatsoever. Does that help you answer your question?
Yeah. one thing I did notice, going back perhaps 15 years ago, I lived in Patchway, and you used to see all the houses in our area and have for sale, for sale, for sale, for sale. And then one day there was like a normal house, what I would call a normal ex-council house, and it had to let. And now there's probably more houses to let privately than there is for sale. In my picture, sold her house. Well, it was a maisonette in Patchway. And we sold it because she went through a divorce. And the estate agent said, oh, he said, the man who bought this house, this is his 20th property.
Yes. No, what I found in Southmead was that people were buying properties from Northern Ireland who then filled it full of workers who were then working for the same man in various businesses all over Bristol. So Mrs. Thatcher's idea of letting people own their own homes, I had people in, I was going to use this as a separate talk about what it was like being a councillor. But I had people that were telling me that they only bought their house because of the what was happening, and they were handing it over all the properties, council properties, to private owners to run instead. Bristol didn't do that. We are, when I was with Shelter, London office helped us bring together questionnaire. And when the Tory government were going to sell off all council-owned property, local authorities had to agree to that, to get rid of all their council housing. And we prepared this, it was about 5 pages of questions. And I went round, I stood on a wooden box out in Wiltshire somewhere, Trowbridge, I think, or somewhere like that. I went all the way over Wiltshire, Somerset, Gloucester, and what is now Avon, handing out this list to people. These are the questions you've got to ask at the public meeting. Get your answers on them. We didn't tell them what they were looking for as replies. And we tried to help them understand it. And when I walked into the public meeting in Weston-super-Mare, forget who it was, somebody was there that, I think it might have been David Redwell or someone. Anyway, he was in the room and he said, well, now we know they're going to vote against, don't they? Jenna's here. But all we were telling them was what they should be asking before they ever agreed to it all. Now you think, how the hell did she live a life like that? Didn't plan it.
I know this is a surprising thing, and it has just surprised me, but here's something that I disagree with Jenny about. Basically is because I don't believe anybody should own their own property. I like the model, which is in Germany and in Holland and in many other places, where renting the property is the thing you do, basically, because these are owners, you know, the big pension funds and other type of things like that, which the properties are very different. And now I know, because I have a friend who lives in Germany, and she's just renewed the lease on her property, and the landlord has to give a year notice before he can occupy that policy. And the tenancy has to give a year notice to the landlord if they want to move. And the laws of the property has to be livable, has to be mold free. It has to be a good place to live in.
Sounds lovely. Let's have it now.
Yeah.
I had, but Ray, when we came to Bristol, I lived in 18 different places, bed sits, everything, hotels in 18 years. We just kept moving. So it was, we're putting down roots and my children are going to get educated.
I'm all for it. David.
Yeah, really interesting to hear about the stories of people in housing and trying to sort out housing for people, not to. I worked for some years when I came to Bristol for a housing developer who owned private housing and was housing homeless people in Bristol. And his concern was that because of the sell-off of council housing and the way that there was a commercial market in housing that was being pumped up and not supported by the government in bringing housing down to fair prices. The whole point was to pump up the market as much as possible. So we're living in something of a housing bubble. So, when Ray talks about rental housing and, whether we own it or we rent it, the real issue should be that we should be running our housing for the benefit of ordinary people, not to create a housing market in which maximum profit is made. And people say, oh, I've got a £500,000 house. And you say, well, look at your insurance and see how much your house is valued at. Oh, it's only down for £50,000 or £80,000. Well, that's the value of the property. If it had to be rebuilt, the rest of it is just artificial, the price of the land and so on. So I think that's something that we really need to address, is how we make property fair and affordable again in our communities, and bring it. And some of the neighbourhoods in Bristol are now building their own housing, not council housing. When the council builds housing, it sort of does it on a commercial model, doesn't it? Where some part of that has to be quote unquote affordable. But some of the communities are now building housing and trying to make it genuinely affordable and genuinely for the people who live in that area, to meet the needs of the people in the area. It's a big topic, isn't it, Jenny? How do we make housing fair and affordable for everybody?
The housing on the north side of Bristol, adjacent to Southmead Ward, which I represented, all that building there, they had all sorts of remits put into their contracts about having some rented and some of owner-occupier and keeping them down, environmental health provision, all the rest of it. As it went through the various stages from department to department to department, after having received, yes, that's fine, a lot of that disappeared. All the good agreements weren't in there. And well, they're going to get another lot of rubbish housing built on the edge of the city.
And my wife, she's on Patchway Town Council. In fact, for a few years, she was mayor of Patchway. And exactly what you said, there was meant to be a certain percentage of affordable housing, and then it's just disappeared. But I might be wrong, but if you build a house that's classed as affordable and somebody buys it, then when they sell it on, would it be true to say that then it's just a normal house and they can sell it for whatever they like?
Yeah.
So it's only affordable housing the first time it's sold.
Mm.
I think
David, now you know why I need your meditation.
yeah.
I need it. I need to escape from some of the world we live in. It's not nice.
Yeah, I was just on I was telling friends I was on a virtual retreat over New Year, meditating with 100 people in Flowdrop in the Netherlands and listening to Maharishi in a beautiful place called Lago di Braies in Italy. But he was in 1965, and I was actually doing self-catering and sleeping overnight in my flat in Bristol. So you can now meditate in a big group, and it can be anywhere in the world. And I really did find it incredibly refreshing just to be able to take my attention away from the world for a few days and settle inside. But many people are just struggling to exist. Mm. And when life is a struggle, you don't have that luxury of being able to refresh and renew. And we need to bring that to more and more people, I think, and then bring more and more intelligence into how we communicate with each other and how we run our communities, so that our communities are run to care for people. Mm.
Okay.
Well, I was just thinking, one thing that's not been mentioned, I no doubt it came after Jenny's work, but another great injustice is this cladding scandal, where, well, there's two actually. It's the cladding scandal, and then there's these leases that people are buying new houses under, where I thought that they were trying to get rid of the leasehold, where you had to pay a ground rent, but it seems to be getting worse in some areas, where people buy new property and there's a reasonable ground rent, but then it can be bumped up and there's nothing they can do about it each year, and it can be an enormous amount. It's just profiteering. Yeah. And the thing with the cladding, it was, people knew that it was risky, but it was profitable. And then they're not taking responsibility. Now they've been found out. It's being dumped on the poor people who've bought in good faith.
Yeah. A lot of the land in South Bristol, in the past, I don't know whether it is now, was owned by Prince Charles and his estate, the Duchy of Cornwall.
I did not know that.
No, you see, shelter workers are funny people. They find out all sorts of things. I mean, I bumped into the underworld, didn't I, quite a lot.
Well, friends, it has come now to 12:10. And unless there is any other comments or questions, I think we sadly have to leave this now.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Jenny. It was very interesting.
Yes, thank you.